Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Good evening and welcome to yet another COVID-19 Conversations. This is session 26 and today we'll be talking about mental health in the Black community. As usual, your co-moderators are Dr. Maya Williams, myself, and Dr. Alison Myers will be asking the questions today. The latest COVID-19 stats, to date, we have over 43 million cases. The 7-day case per rate of 100,000 is 42.9, and the total number of deaths is slowly edging up to close to 600,000, and it stands now at 592,000. The COVID-19 vaccination stats in the US, the total number of vaccines delivered is 366 million. The total number administered is 296 million. The total number of population or the percentage of the population that's vaccinated or at least one dose is 50.8%, and fully vaccinated, which means 2 weeks after receiving the second dose or the first dose for the Johnson & Johnson is 41%. And despite the world opening up right now, we still have disparities in the COVID-19 vaccine. The country's decline in COVID-19 case rates present an unrealistic, optimistic perspective for half of the nation, the half that is still not vaccinated. As more people receive vaccines, COVID-19 cases are occurring mostly in the increasingly narrow slice of the unprotected population. So the Washington Post recently adjusted its case, death, and hospitalization rates to account for that and found that in some places, the virus continues to rage among those who haven't received a shot. Adjustments for vaccinations shows that rate among susceptible unvaccinated people is 70% higher than the standard figures being publicized. And so while everybody is saying, let's have a hot girl summer, or hot girl summer is trending, vaccination rates continue to lag in communities of color, particularly the Black community. The narrative that Black people and communities of color more widely are more vaccine hesitant may not be the whole story. Instead, health experts argue lack of access to vaccines and structural barriers also hurt vaccination rates in these communities. And so we know, as we've seen for the past 18 months, that COVID-19 has definitely impacted Black and Brown communities. We have seen more deaths in our communities. Some of us know somebody who has either died or have been infected by the COVID-19 vaccine. Some of us have lost our jobs. We are more likely to be essential workers and have to go to work in the middle of the pandemic. Some of us have to return to work, and that is very taxing. It can be very anxiety inducing. We have high rates of depression, and that could affect our mental health. And so today we will be talking about mental health in the Black community. And I need to warn you that this might be triggering for some individuals. And so 13.4% of the US population identifies as Black or African American. Of those, over 16% reported having a mental illness in the past year. That is over 7 million. And that is more than the population of Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia combined. At least Black Americans are 20% more likely to experience serious mental illness problems than the general population. And African Americans are 30% more likely to report having serious psychological distress. And as with everything else that we've seen over the past year, there are disparities in mental health. Racial disparities or unfair differences within the system of mental health are well documented. Research indicates that compared with people who are white, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, that's BIPOC individuals, are less likely to have access to mental health services, less likely to seek out services, less likely to receive needed care, more likely to receive poor quality of care, and more likely to end services prematurely. There is also research that shows that when Black patients have healthcare providers who look like them, they have better physical and mental health outcomes. Yet, the vast majority of mental health treatment providers in the United States are white. So for example, approximately 86% of psychologists are white and less than 2% of American Psychological Association members are African Americans. That is, we only have 2,000 Black psychiatrists in the US, and we are lucky to have one of us with us tonight. In addition, 5.6% of advanced practice psychiatric nurses and 12.6% of social workers are members of minority groups. Again, we are lucky to have one of them with us tonight. Some research has demonstrated that provider bias and stereotyping are relevant factors in health disparities. And for the past 4 decades, Black mental health professionals have been advocating for increased cultural competency training, which has focused on the examination of provider attitude beliefs, reducing to help reduce disparities in mental health. Yet, despite these efforts, racial disparities still exist even after controlling for factors such as income, insurance status, age, and symptom presentation. Established barriers for people of color are different cultural perceptions about mental illness, racism and discrimination, greater vulnerability to being uninsured, access barriers and communication barriers, fear and mistrust of treatment. Roughly 7% of Black men meet the criteria for a lifetime prevalence of major depressive disorder. Applying that figure to recent national population estimate means that there are 1.4 million Black men currently suffering from major depression. Moreover, given the high rates of stigma and unmet need in this population, it is likely that these figures are even more dire. We often treat boys, particularly Black boys, as if they are problems to be solved rather than wonders to behold. Black men aren't judged by whether they are healthy, but rather they are judged by whether they contribute financially to their households, pay child support, and are active participants in their families and communities. And this can be triggering and lead to mental health outcomes, particularly if they are unable to meet these expectations. On the other hand, strong Black women is a mantra for so much as part of the US culture that it is seldom realized how great of a toll it has taken on the emotional well-being of Black women. The strong Black women is a race gender schema that prescribes culturally specific feminine expectations for Black women, including unyielding strength, assumption of multiple roles, and caring for others. Black women are socialized by media, parents, and the communities to internalize and accept the strong Black women's schema. And although this schema is rooted in Black women's strength and resilience and may give her the illusion of control, it keeps her from identifying what she needs and reaching out for help. This may result in adverse mental and physical health outcomes such as depression and cardiovascular disease. And so I'll talk now about slavery and mental health and give you a little bit of a historical context. In the United States, scientific racism has been used to justify slavery to appease the moral oppression to the Atlantic slave trade. Black men were described as having primitive psychological organization, making them uniquely fitted for bondage. Benjamin Rush, who often referred to as the father of American psychiatry, described Negroes as suffering from an affliction called negritude, and this disorder was thought to be a mild form of leprosy in which the only cure was to become white. In 1951, prominent American physician Samuel Cartwright defined drapetomania as the treatable mental disease that caused Black slaves to flee captivity. He stated that the disorder was a consequence of slave masters who made themselves too familiar with the slaves treating them as equals. Cartwright used the Bible as support for his position, stating that slaves needed to be kept in the submissive state and treated like children to both prevent and cure them from running away. Treatment included whipping the devil out of them as a preventative measure. The claim that those who were free suffered mental illness at higher rates than those who were enslaved was not unique to Cartwright. The US censors made the same claim that this was used as a political weapon against abolitionists, although the claim was found to be flawed. Even at the turn of the 20th century, leading academic psychiatrists claimed that Negroes were psychologically unfit for freedom. Furthermore, after slavery was abolished, sovereign states embraced the criminal justice system as a means of racial control. Black codes led to the imprisonment of unprecedented numbers of Black men, women, and children who were returned to slavery-like conditions for the forced labor and convict leasing that lasted well into the 20th century. Scientific racism early on indicates motives for control and containment for profitability, leading health professionals to propagate the idea that Blacks were less than to justify exploitation and experimentation. The mislabeling of behavior such as escaping slavery as a byproduct of mental illness did not stop there. Significant transformations in defining mental illness also occurred in the civil rights era, suggesting that institutional racism becomes more powerful in the context moments of heightened racial tensions in the collective social consciousness. And so now we talk about racism, police brutality, and mental health. The public awareness of police killings in unarmed Black Americans have been galvanized by the high-profile deaths of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, among others. Black Americans are nearly 3 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police, accounting for more than 40% of victims of all police killings nationwide, and 5 times more likely than white Americans to be killed unarmed. Beyond the immediate consequences for victims and their families, police killings may also affect the mental health of people not directly connected to the killings or to the people involved through various mechanisms, including heightened perceptions of systemic racism and lack of fairness, loss of social status and self-regard, increased fear for victimization, and greater mortality expectations and communal bereavement, among others. There's also disparities in mental health research. Studies of psychiatric disorders among racial and ethnic minority populations are exceedingly rare. This is due to several factors, but primarily because historically there has been a lack of racial and ethnic minority researchers who investigate these issues. To reduce disparities in mental health research, the first step is to recognize that there is a problem and that systemic racism is at its root. Second, when it comes to the mental health of Black Americans, we cannot do it alone. We need to partner with key stakeholders in our community and listen to them to find ways to be able to have interventions and to improve screenings. And lastly, recruitment of more Black psychiatrists and psychologists into the field and funding of Black scientists is also welcome. While not all Black researchers study Black populations, most do, and their voices are critical in our understanding of mental illness and disseminating that knowledge into the community. And so earlier this week, we heard about Naomi Osaka, who protected her mental health and said that she was not going to do the media in the French opening. And that created a lot of back and forth and discourse where some people were like, yeah, great, we advocate for her, while others were like, she is privileged. And while we do stand for Naomi Osaka, we realize every day that there are so many Black individuals who would like to leave a job, but are unable to leave a job for whatever reason. And so we need to be able to protect our mental health and indulge in self-care, because despite what individuals think, self-care is not selfish. And so we'd like to thank the following individuals for helping make this possible. First and foremost, we'd like to thank the African American / Afro-Caribbean Business Employee Resource Group, or BURGS, at Northwell Health. We'd like to thank Dr. Naomi Maria, our Day One audience members, Dr. Jana Andrews and Dr. Alan Tolles for making this possible, Mr. Richard Laroche. Also follow us on Minority Health 3 on Twitter and minorityhealth.convos. And joining us for our lovely conversation tonight are all returning guests. We have Dr. Claire Greenford, who is a social justice advocate and executive director of the National Association of Social Workers, the NYC chapter. We also have Danny, who is a life and success coach, a hypnotist, and owner of Grounding Your Crown. And we also have Dr. Lauren Hanna, who is a psychiatrist at the Zucker Hillside Hospital. And now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Allison Myers to start asking the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. And as a correction, we actually have 2 psychiatrists. I also train in psychiatry as well. I just tend to use more of my medicine. So it's actually 2 Black girls, Dr. Hannah and myself, that have psychiatry training. Thank you. So speaking of Dr. Hannah, I'm going to start off with the first question. Our first question is in relation to what's going on with COVID-19. There's a lot of complex interactions between the COVID-19 pandemic, structural racism, and mental health inequities that have led to devastating health, economic, and social consequences. Can you explain to us the relationship between exposure to racism and its impact on our mental and physical health?
Yes, thanks so much, Dr. Myers, and it's a pleasant surprise. You learn something new every day that we have another psychiatrist in the house. So it was a nice surprise for me to hear. So this idea of like the interconnection between the inequity, structural racism, and effect on our mental health. So when we think about the symptoms that constitute trauma, reactions to a traumatic event, we're thinking about first that there's an event or a series of events that will trigger the trauma. There are intrusive symptoms. These could be thoughts, memories that you don't want to kind of keep on popping up in your head, images that pop up in your head, upsetting dreams. Other than the intrusive symptoms, there's avoidance, trying to avoid either experiences that trigger thoughts about the event, or trying to avoid like internal experiences, the thoughts and memories, like just trying to not deal with it. There are negative thoughts, feelings, and negative symptoms. So people can experience emotions of like fear, depression, anger, irritability, negative symptoms, meaning like kind of like withdrawal socially, kind of being more quiet, like not being as expressive or having the same personality that when they're in their optimal health. And then the last being arousal or hyperactivity. So when people are kind of like keyed up, always on edge, might not have difficulty sleeping, irritable, easily triggered. So these are kind of the major categories that we think of that can occur to a person on the individual level in response to trauma. Now, when we're thinking about racial trauma, we're not just thinking about the individual, we're also thinking in the context of history and of society. So we have to, when you're diagnosing severe forms of trauma response to something like PTSD, which are very rare that people experience severe forms of trauma, but one of the risk factors is actually being a member of a non-white racial group or an ethnic minority. And I believe that this risk factor is because, we come with a lot of stuff from just the stress of living as people of color in a world that is dominated currently and historically by white supremacy, right? So then when you think about what are the things that we're all experiencing after just being exposed to social media and all these stuff from 2020, not only like COVID, but all of the racial violence, and then also kind of the gaslighting, where maybe at our places of work, COVID's all talked about, but like everyone's mom's silent about the racial violence. The things that are the things that we bring with us from our history that make everything we experience so much more difficult is intergenerational trauma. So trauma that is from the past that kind of continues through the present, is passed along through the generations, that is on purpose, a purposeful trauma towards our group, that is a collective experience and that persists throughout the generations. So I think that when we're thinking about the complex interplay, it's like we're thinking not only about us individually experiencing all of the hardships of 2020 and 21, but like it's bringing back all of that collective stuff that we've dealt with, like in terms of discrimination through our childhoods, through our parents' childhoods, our grandparents. Like it's all easily triggered.
Yeah, and speaking of our history, I just put in the chat for everyone who's listening that on June 19th, we're having a celebration at Roy Wilkins Park for Juneteenth in commemoration of the fact that we were free. And of course, we weren't told until many months later. And Dr. Hannah will actually be on a virtual panel that week. So you can check out in the chat, the link is there. It's www.juneteenthinqueens.com. Again, that's www.juneteenthinqueens.com. So there'll be a lot of good information for those of you who are interested in learning more about some of the history that she was just referring to. Please come out and check it out. And also you can see that they'll be having virtual events about the history of Black folks here in New York, as well as in the country. So to follow up on that question, this question's for Dr. C. Historically, the Black community was and continues to be disadvantaged in mental health throughout subjection to trauma, which initially started during enslavement, as well as during the years of and colonialism, as well as racism and segregation. A growing body of research suggests that traumatic experiences can cause profound biological changes in the person experiencing the traumatic event. And intergenerational trauma, which Dr. Hannah just spoke about, may be passed down biologically from one generation to the next. In light of mental health being taboo, a subject for many in our community, what can the present generation do during this time to protect their mental health and as well as those of the future generations?
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be here. And I think it's wonderful. We're just coming off of Mental Health Awareness Month. This is also Men's Health Awareness Month. So I appreciate Dr. Williams also mentioning men in the beginning of her introduction. So I would say that what we're doing right now is a way that we can actually help this current generation deal with and address mental health needs, of having open conversations. The incident with Naomi Osaka was also mentioned, and I think that's something that we really should center and talk about. We're seeing more young people speaking about and normalizing a very normal thing. I always tell people your reaction is normal to an abnormal situation. I think the more that we can have conversations around the fact that our brains go with us, it is the most incredible computer ever designed, and it controls our body and our emotions and everything, the more I think we can normalize it in our families and communities. I think we are seeing a shift in the Black and Brown communities regarding acknowledging the dis-ease that has resulted from all the race-based trauma, the years and years of stress that have been going on. I think it's up to us to continue these conversations. I think it's also important, particularly when we talk about intergenerational, intercultural as well, for people to start working to find ways to build the bridges. I think of my own family. I'm from Barbados, and I can think of the Caribbean, we don't really talk about mental health a lot. But I know that in talking to family members, we won't say mental health, but I started to weave and put stories together and recognize this person was not well, or this individual wasn't well, and there wasn't a word for it, right? You're just mad. And we kind of distanced it. And so now I'm saying, do you think maybe this person had postpartum depression? That sounds like postpartum depression to me. Oh, this person, they drank a lot of alcohol and, they died, their liver got bad. But what you're describing to me sounds like major depressive disorder, because you're telling me that they didn't have a problem with alcohol until their children died in a fire. And then they started drinking a lot. Yeah, that sounds like they were really depressed, which is normal because that's such a traumatic event and you didn't get help for it. So I think one of the best things we can do is continue to talk about it. I've loved the response, particularly of young people, to what happened to Naomi Osaka. People have come out. They have been pretty much dragging the French Open and saying this is not okay. And it's right, because if she said, I have a stomach flu, I can't play, we would have accepted that. But if she says, I just need not to have to go and talk to the media and have all these questions, particularly questions that can be very harmful for me mentally and emotionally and are causing anxiety, and you're fined $15,000 for centering your health, that in of itself is problematic. We've been talking so much about mental health, but yet we still criminalize it and we weaponize people's own mental health needs against them. And so I think the more we continue to talk about it, the more we normalize it, and the more we challenge the stereotypes, because we are humans. The amount of melanin in your skin does not absolve you of dealing with any issue in this world. And so I think this conversation is important, and I'm really grateful to be here. And I'll pass it back to you because I know others have to speak.
You forgot she's got bats in Chabelle-free. That's another one they would say. Yes, it's so true. And I think this is for all of us across the diaspora. I don't think, and it doesn't matter if you're Caribbean, American, or African. I think that unfortunately this is something that transcends across all groups of us, whether wherever we come from in the diaspora. So now I'm going to turn to you, Danny. I have a question. When we think of self-care, because in a lot of this, we're talking about mental health. A lot of this, we say we need self-care. Naomi decided to walk away because she needed self-care and mental health day, time to kind of recover from all this. We often think about just taking care of the body. Very rarely do we also think of taking care of our minds. What self-care practices or techniques can we do to free ourselves from the emotional trauma of the past, and even this past year with the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the impact of COVID on our community?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me back again. Yes, mental health is a big one when it comes to self-care. A lot of the time, I just made a post a few days ago and it was like, self-care is more than just like taking bubble baths and listening to like high frequency meditations. And while those things are great and they feel good, that's just scratching the surface. One of the biggest things that I think is important for people to do is to start to do some inner child work, do some shadow work, really understanding why you're feeling the trauma behind the things that you're feeling. So I'll give you like a little of an example for myself. I lost my mom when I was very young. I was 13. And so I grew up and I dealt with the grief. I had an amazing grief counselor, but I didn't realize that the anxiety that I was feeling years and years and years later was because of the inner child wounds that I had suffered from a child. There's so many things that we carry as women of color that are embedded in our DNA. A lot of the traumas that we have experienced go far beyond what we've experienced, go beyond what our grandparents have experienced and then some. So I think the most important thing when it comes to self-care is to start to work down through the bottom, try to figure out what's really going on beyond the bubble baths. The stuff is good, but really just doing that inner, deeper healing to really understand why are we reacting the ways that we are? Why are these things affecting us in the ways that they do? So that way we're able to approach it with a healthier mindset to be able to evoke change instead of it changing us.
I'm sorry for your loss, and it just made me think of something that I will pose to Dr. Hannah and Dr. Claire. Is that speaking of loss and grief, Mother's Day just passed, Father's Day is coming, and personally, I know people, and I'm sure all of you, who've lost people in the past year, whether it be COVID or not. And how do you really deal with that grief? How do you process that and deal with these memories and these holidays that are coming up?
Are you opening it up or you?
Yeah, yeah. I just thought about that when you said that. I think a lot of people are having a tough time. I know my mother lost her mom like 40 something years ago, and she says she can't stand Mother's Day, even though she's happy to be a mom. But she said ever since like losing her mom, and like I said, I know a lot of people have lost their family members, especially parents, in the past year. So can we recommend that they deal with grief? I know you mentioned you did, Danny, but maybe our psychiatrist could just comment on that.
Yeah, I think that when you're dealing with grief, it's important to give yourself permission to feel. I think that, there are, I know that there are a lot of probably ideas out in the world about like what is appropriate, what is acceptable, what's normal. And I think like the reality is that, grief is unique and looks different to every different person. Some of these kind of misperceptions are even put out there by mental health professionals. You look up, versions of the DSM-5, like in the psychiatry Bible, they'll have certain timelines of, oh, grief is supposed to be this long, and it just is not, it's just not the case. It's something that's like peeling layers of an onion. So it's like there's like waves of grief. So sometimes something happens and you might not feel anything initially, and then time passes and the waves hit, and then they're like tsunamis, and then maybe over time like the waves get like more and more manageable, and then something else happens later in life you're not expecting, and the waves come back. So I think just allowing yourself to kind of experience your own unique process of grieving, and finding support systems who are helping you feel those emotions in a healthy way, not putting kind of judgments or negative labels or evaluations on the way in which your own grief individually manifests.
If I can jump in there, I think that's so important. And I'm so appreciative that you mentioned that, just because it's in the DSM for the timeframes, because they've always bothered me. I'm like, how do we put this limit? If you've known someone for 40 years, how does grieving for them more than 2 weeks mean something is like, you don't get over 40 years in 2 weeks? So I think it's so important that we also acknowledge all the cultural aspects of it and what COVID-19 has meant. COVID-19 took away many of the cultural and socially acceptable ways of actually grieving and receiving support. I know my husband lost his mother last year. I've done many talks. Between March and May, there were 8 people I knew that died. And the last 3 were within 6 weeks in significant relationships. And it was almost numbing, right? I couldn't feel. I can't process that much grief and watch somebody else I know and love suffer and also be in pain for that. And so what I recognized was I have delayed grief. And I think that's also important. Recognize that can be normal as well, because sometimes it is so much. I always say our minds are amazing. God designed it amazing. Sometimes there's so much going on, we literally kind of shut off, and that's a protective thing that happens in our minds. But it's important to know that when we start having difficulties in our normal daily activities, when you notice that you yourself, you may not be able to get up and shower, you just have a loss of interest in life, you're not getting pleasure from things, that's when it's going beyond normal grief reactions, and when I think it's really important, particularly to reach out and get help. And help can come in many forms. Spiritual communities can be helpful. Practitioners and mental health providers can be really helpful, but making sure that you do get that support and be consistent with it. But I so appreciate the mention of grief, and it does come in waves, but we do have to also find ways that we can honor the life of those who have transitioned, right? So COVID took something away, but how can you still honor that individual? And how can you continue to live, right? How can you let their legacy and the love and the passion that you have for them continue to shine through in your life while also getting supports? And knowing that if 3 years later, you have a day where you just break down and you're crying hysterically because the pain just feels like it happened 3 minutes ago, that's okay.
And I wanted to circle back to you, Danny, now to close the topic off. Did you want to add anything else about your process of grieving?
Absolutely. The delayed grief, I can completely relate with that. And it's so true. Just giving yourself the permission to feel and be. When I did lose my mom, in the beginning, it was incredibly overwhelming. I moved house and a lot of things happened. And then there were some years in college where I missed her. I thought about her, but it wasn't debilitating. And then as I grew more into adulthood and I started thinking about kids and, when I got married, and then the feelings of grief came back as if it was the beginning all over again. And so I love that you both mentioned just making room for yourself. I think making room for yourself when it comes to grief, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to self-care, making room for ourselves is so important, especially as Black women. We are trained and we're brought up to make room for everyone else. And like you mentioned in the slide, the strong Black woman, right? And so, sometimes making room and giving ourselves permission to take up a bunch of space is something that's very challenging. So whether it's in grief or whether it's just dealing with the day-to-day life from work or whatever it is that it is, just allowing us to take up more space.
Absolutely. So obviously grief is one part of the spectrum, but we also have people who also have more severe illnesses, which Dr. Claire was alluding to, things like depression, bipolar, psychosis. And in 2018, 50% of Black or African Americans with serious mental illness did not receive mental health treatment. And of course, this is not only in our community, but like Latino, Asian communities as well, because as Dr. Williams said earlier, look at the number of providers that can service our people. The cultural stigma surrounding mental illness is partially responsible, yet COVID-19 has given our community permission to seek therapy as the world tries to process this triple pandemic. There's a decrease in the stigma and an increase in people in the BIPOC community reaching out. What can we as a community do to preserve this momentum and normalize seeking therapy? So I'll pose this to you, Dr. Claire, first, and then Dr. Hannah, you can comment as well.
Absolutely. So again, I think this conversation and what's happening, think social media has been amazing in really centering what we are experiencing as human beings. So I think that being able to continue to push the message out that this is normal, getting help. I've loved the memes I've been seeing. Let's make therapy a thing we do. I've seen things like that. I love my therapist. Side note, I really do love my therapist. Super dope, because every Tuesday, 5:30, it doesn't matter what's happening. Unless the world blows up, I'm in therapy. And it's so important that we even say that, right? I have so many friends for years, they wouldn't say they were in therapy. And I didn't understand that because some of these were also mental health providers. But then that myth of the strong Black woman, the strong Latina, all of those filtered how they were able to communicate and engage in the world because you couldn't be seen as weak. Shifting the narrative and helping people understand that one of the strongest things you can do is ask for help, I think is something that can really be helpful for our community and how we normalize this time and capitalize on this momentum. There's so many things that are popping up right now, support groups for BIPOC communities, they're happening, circles, all these different things. We're seeing churches talking more about mental health. Hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, because now we can stop saying that if you pray enough, it'll go. No, people had mental illness in the Bible. So why do we think that we don't have it now, right? And so I think that continuing to talk about it and challenging those, when you see people say things, also challenge it. I know a few years ago, my pastor's big church and made a comment about schizophrenia. As people make it as though it's this joke thing. And I wrote a long email, never got a response, but for me, it was important to say, please, don't use mental health from the pulpit as a way to kind of show that, people need to have more faith or that, these things can go away. Do I believe I'm Christian? Do I believe God can heal any and everything? Yes. But do I also know that the Bible said that we were going to have troubles? Yeah. So if God acknowledged that we were going to have struggles in life, Why do we not acknowledge it? If God modeled for us that he had 12 disciples on this earth, which means he needed a crew, why do we think we can do this by ourselves? And so I think continuing to have those conversations and normalizing and humanizing, giving ourselves permission to take back our humanity is how I think we shift this narrative.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I am very encouraged to see in social media spaces with the youth acceptance in our communities of mental health awareness and mental health treatment. I know that there's definitely still a stigma. One thing that's, always irksome whenever I'm, just watching the news, engaging in media is like how frequently you'll hear language that is insensitive to those who live with mental health conditions. And so the stigma is definitely still there. I think that multiple opposing truths can be true at the same time. So SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association, in 2015, they did a survey and tried to look amongst various racial groups, what are the barriers to unreceived mental health treatment. And the biggest barrier was in the survey was actually the cost, right? So although there is stigma that kind of pushes us away, the cost pushes us away. I think the knowledge of some of the realities of the context of the broken kind of healthcare system that we're navigating in the U.S. It also requires some endurance and perseverance for people who have gotten to the stage of that they're seeking out mental health services, and a reality that that there are significant barriers. There is a shortage of psychiatrists, a shortage of mental health providers, and so it can be very, very difficult for people to find treatment either through insurance or fee for service. So I think that once the stigma is overcome and people are reaching out for help, it's also important to kind of be resilient and persevere and continue to look for the help, even though it might not be easy, or you might not be able to always get a mental health provider who shares your lived experience, because there's only couple of us. I don't know what percentage me and Dr. Myers make up, but who knows, a significant majority perhaps. But I think that knowing that it's worth the effort, right? So look for someone. It might be like a waiting list, a longer waiting list. Get yourself on the waiting list. In terms of finding someone who you connect with, I think the most important thing is that you can build a trusting relationship. So it would be great if we could all have mental health providers who share our lived experience and understand some of the challenges that we deal with as people of color. But I think it's not necessary. The thing that's necessary is that you find someone you have a good relationship with. So even if they might be new to our experience, they're willing to listen and learn and support you through the shared journey of trying to get to know yourself better and trying to heal from some of the traumas or whatever the reasons are that you're seeking treatment. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I have something to say, reference. I'm just piggybacking on what you said, Dr. Hannah. Therapy for Black girls, there's actually a session. Dr. Joy actually has it's session 202. In case you miss it, it's Shedding Your Superwoman Status. That's the name of the podcast, or that episode of the podcast. And she was talking about exactly what you said. And she said some of the downfalls of actually having a therapist of color is that with our strong Black woman status, we don't talk to the therapist because we're like, oh, she has everything of hers together, and so I will not feel comfortable enough to open up. And so there is this push now, as much as you want a therapist of color, maybe go to somebody who might not necessarily share the lived experiences with you, but also who could basically understand, and it's the same basic principles. And the other thing that I want to say is that sometimes it is okay to break up with your therapist. I know that a lot of people think that if I have one therapist, I have to stick to this therapist for life. And I often say it's like dating. it's like a relationship. Like you all might not necessarily click. She might, say something that you do not like, and it's okay. Do not ghost her, but please just have the conversation. Like, she could take it, but just have the conversation around that. And it's okay for you to just, be open with your therapist about those kind of things.
100%. It's actually for most types of therapy, it's necessary, right? Like therapy is about a relationship, so there's going to be like breaks and repairs, and that's usually where like the meat in certain types of therapy, dynamic therapy specifically, that's where the meat is. Like when there's these little like tiny rifts in the relationship that kind of may or may not represent echoes from past significant relationships, and that's really what you're trying to be working on. So I think that in terms of it's okay to break up with your therapist, don't ghost them, but then also be aware that resistance is a huge hurdle, right? That that it's also grist for the mill in any kind of therapeutic relationship. So cost, like difficulty finding, all of these things are things that if you let it will sabotage your attempts to try to get help. But once you're in help, realize that it's very, very normal that there'll be a million little things. They'll be like, oh, I don't want to do therapy, because therapy is scary. Therapy requires that you have to change and expose yourself consciously to things about yourself that you don't really know and then might be scary. And so there's a million reasons that we will all find to try to run kicking and screaming away from that process, and be aware, be prepared for that, the resistances that come up, but just try to kind of, if you have a good relationship with your therapist, stick resistances.
Yeah, and sometimes we forget there's also alternative forms of therapy. So a lot of times people think it's just laying on a couch, the stereotypical Freudian, but there's other different forms of things that you can use to release some of this energy. Yoga is one really good way of conducting stress relief if you don't feel comfortable talking to somebody, Reiki therapy, and also hypnosis. And Danny, I know that hypnosis is something that you've been involved in, but a lot of people kind of scared because they're falling asleep. They don't really understand what it's about. So could you shed some light on hypnosis, how you can use that for therapy?
So I love hypnosis. I grew up learning that hypnosis was bad. It was mind control, and that, you shouldn't be hypnotized, and people are going to control what you're doing and control your thoughts, and you should always be in control. But hypnosis is not mind control. It's the furthest thing from it. Dr. Claire, earlier you spoke about dis-ease and how disease is a lack of ease in the body. Well, hypnosis is the opposite. It's intense relaxation. You're not asleep. You're just really, really, really relaxed. And so when you are that relaxed, I'm able to, because I'm certified in hypnotherapy, I'm able to be able to bypass that conscious barrier and just speak to your subconscious mind and input direct commands or really creative metaphors that will help you to be able to get past whatever it is that you're going through. You can use hypnosis for a number of things. You can use it for weight loss. You can use it for reducing anxiety, for stress. One thing that I am very mindful of as a life coach is that I work with people who do not need medical attention. If someone is dealing with something that is deeply rooted in trauma, although there are techniques that I can do, I don't, because I understand that it is very important and very delicate to direct people to where they need the most help. And so if I'm working with someone who wants to, experience hypnotism, then they're probably stressed out, or maybe they have goals, or maybe they have some limiting beliefs about themselves. So through hypnosis and other techniques, we're able to bypass that conscious layer and really get to, have some fun.
Thank you, Danny. And I have this question for all three of you guys. So how do you suggest, Dr. Maria asked, how do you suggest going about finding a therapist or psychotherapist? And I'd like to also add a hypnotist in there. And any tips on how to identify one that would be most likely match with you? And also for Dr. Claire, like how could you get a social worker? I know sometimes I have also told my friends that it's okay for you to, go to a social worker and have therapy sessions with them. So how can individuals go about, finding therapists, social workers, psychotherapists, and hypnosis?
Do you want me to? Okay, I wasn't sure who that was for. So I think Google is a really great resource. I think it's really helpful to just kind of put in therapist, right? If you do have insurance, and I want to be clear that insurance is a privilege to have. If you do have insurance, I would also say one of the things is you might start with reaching out to your insurance panel and asking them for mental health providers. I would also suggest asking your network, right? Like that's a really great way to know or get connected to people. I think particularly for the community of providers that are BIPOC, tend to kind of know some people or know each other because it's not that many. So being able to connect people to those resources as well is something I think that can help people find the right fit. And I do agree, and I'm so appreciative that you said you can fire your therapist. You can, because you have to have a right fit. Now, I personally believe that therapy should always be like fairy tales and lullabies? No, like a therapist that is going to challenge you. If you're not being challenged to address and go deeper, then I'm going to say to you, you might need to shift, honestly, because you at sometimes you're going to leave therapy pissed off. That's okay. It's going to leave therapy crying because in order for us to shift and kind of what Danny's talking about, shifting that subconscious, we have to challenge that stuff, right? We have to be challenged. I think looking on, there's so many websites, honestly, that have therapists. I know for NASW New York City, we partner with My Wellbeing, which is a web-based and app-based program. They help you find a therapist. You put in what you want, therapy for Black girls, therapy for Black men, therapists for Black girls, which is based in Brooklyn. There's a lot of different places and spaces that you can find a provider. But I want to say it is important to understand the credentialing of the provider and what that is and what it means. Because they are certain licenses are allowed to do certain things. And I know it gets very confusing. Every single practitioner cannot do the same thing. Dr. Myers and Dr. Hannah are medical doctors. They can prescribe medications. They can they can admit, right? Like a social worker cannot prescribe medications. Are some of us trained in medications? Yeah, psychopharm is my thing, so is the brain. But the reality is that that's not everyone's. So just making sure that or you at least ask, right? And you don't have to know everything, but asking people, what are your credentials? What is your training? Do you have experience with this? Do you know anybody that has experience with this? Because it's an interview, it's dating, right? I mean, hopefully we're really putting people that we're dating through the rigor. We want to make sure that it is a good fit, but I will also say give it some time, because I think what happens is sometimes we get connected to a therapist, we have a few sessions, we don't like it, it's uncomfortable, we're like, this person's bad because they're challenging you. I always tell people, give it like 3 to 4 months, just see, and be honest with your therapist along the way. You're not going to hurt their feelings, I promise you. It's not abnormal for any of this to happen, but I do think it's important that you ask those questions and continue to ask. Thrive NYC, all these different places have resources, but I think Google honestly is a really good place, and just asking.
Dr. Hannah or Danny, any additional suggestions?
I would like to also add, I think everything that you said is spot on. That's exactly what I've done. Also using your resources throughout the communities. But something else that I've noticed is that a lot of businesses now have Instagram accounts where you're able to get a chance to see what's going on in a different kind of way that we didn't have access to years and years ago. So when it comes to like the coaching field, a lot of coaches have Instagram accounts. And so if you're interested in a coach, you're interested in someone to do hypnotherapy with you, and they have an Instagram account, check out what they have, check out what programs they have, check out the testimonials they have, the different people that they've reached. You can get a lot. I mean, you won't get everything from an Instagram account, but now the way that businesses are set up, they're using Instagram as a professional portfolio. So you can go to Instagram or to different social media platforms to see what's provided. A lot of people now are doing free things. They might have like a free monthly call, or they might have like every 2 or 3 months, they'll do a free something or another. So check those out as well. So that way you can get a feel of what that person is like. A lot of therapists do like free discovery calls or free like getting to know you consultations. So you have a lot of resources to still just kind of get your feet wet and see what's out there before making a decision. And like you said, if it's not a good fit, it's something that can be changed. But I do agree, definitely giving it some time. because it's going to pull up some uncomfortable things. And the reason why they're buried deep down is because it was protecting you. So if someone is pulling up those things that were pushed down and safe, you're going to feel pretty uncomfortable. But yeah, definitely using Instagram and social media as a source to just get some more information is helpful.
I usually when people are looking to go the insurance route, I usually refer people to the website ZocDoc.com, which is not only a great place to look for a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. It's also a great place to look for any other type of medical specialist that you're looking for. You can look up people by specialty, by insurance, and by zip code. PsychologyToday.com is also a great resource for people looking for mental health treatment. There's a couple of other good kind of tips that to find people. If you are ever looking for going to like academic center affiliated hospitals, there are usually training programs for mental health providers there, both for psychiatrists and psychotherapists, maybe some social workers as well, but the ones I know of, mainly psychiatrists and psychotherapists. So you can usually find a cost-effective mental health treatment by going to a hospital that is affiliated with a university or academic center. If you're looking for a specific type of psychotherapy, like psychodynamic psychotherapy, you can often look for analytic institutes. Usually, I think for most of them, the mental health providers are fee for service, but because they're also candidates in training, you can oftentimes find people who can negotiate a more reasonable price. So those are a couple of the things I usually recommend.
And then just to piggyback on that too, like sometimes when you go on psychology.com or therapyforblackgirls.com, you will see the list of specialties. So if you're looking for, say, a psychologist, sorry, not a psychologist, but if you're looking for a work therapist, for example, you don't go to look for somebody who does with trauma or cognitive behavioral therapy, or somebody who does coupling counseling. You have to go specifically look at the specialty and see that the individual does work therapy. Or so take for example, I know when I was looking for a therapist, there were certain things that I needed. I specifically needed somebody who had a background in immigration, who had a background with dealing with Caribbean women, because I know that I had, the added layer or the intersectionality of, immigration that an African American woman, no offense to them, would not be able to tell me. Would just be like, why don't you go and get married? Or, something along those lines. So you have to look for those things if you're looking for a therapist. And it's like I said, you always date. You pass multiple of them sometimes, but it's all about getting the good fit. And that's the pleasure of it all, is that the therapists don't take things personally. You're just like, all right, that isn't working out for me. And they sometimes recommend based on like Dr. Claire said, there's this small network so that they can recommend those things for you.
Yeah, and another good resource for people who have been victims of trauma, because I think trauma, unfortunately, people have a hard time finding someone good, but Safe Horizon is a good option for people who have issues with trauma, because trauma, which we've talked about, is not something that just anybody can treat. There are people who are specially trained in it. So that's another good resource, and it's and you don't have to pay for it. So if you've been a victim of abuse or a violent attack here in the city or even on Long Island, Safe Horizon actually works with the police department. They don't tell your business, obviously, but that's what the Victim Advocates Group would give you as a reference, or you can look it up yourself. In fact, one of my patients, I was able to find that through talking to them, and I wasn't seeing them for anything related to psychiatric illness, but she was in a domestic violence situation, and I actually gave her the number to call. And that's a very dicey thing to have to deal with. And thankfully, because I had training in psychiatry, I was able to help this young lady. And her primary care, when I reached out, he felt kind of embarrassed that he actually missed it. But it's something that can be very subtle. And if you're not trained in this area, again, you would not know to even look for these things. So I think all of these points that all of you have made are very salient as to why it's important that you find what you're looking for. You may not make the cultural connection, but they may be someone who's a specialist in your area. So absolutely really important. And we don't have a lot of time left. So I think what I would just like to ask is for each one of you to give us one pearl of wisdom in terms of what we can do as BIPOC people in terms of our mental health. And then I'll turn it back over to Maya.
So I will leave with you what I said earlier today, something that I wish that everyone just takes and implements in their lives is to take up space. You deserve to be exactly where you are. Your feelings are valid. And it's hard when we know something and we're like, I should know better, or like, why is this bothering me now? Like, but just take up space, allow yourself all of the room that you need. So that is what I want to leave with you. Thank you so much for having me, ladies.
That was beautiful. And ditto, I would just say that you're worth it. You're worth fighting for. You're worth help. You're worth treatment. You're worth centering yourself. The most important person in your life has to be you. It's not selfless. It's being self-full. You cannot give from an empty cup. You have to have a healthy ego to give your healthy ego. So being able to center yourself and knowing that you're worth it, you're worth the treatment, you're worth the checkout days, you're worth the days when you say, I'm going to eat chocolate and lay on the couch. By the way, I personally believe chocolate is salad because it comes from the cocoa plant. But I'm just saying, the doctors may disagree. But the reality is that you're worth it, because there's no one on this planet who will ever be like you, who will ever be you, who can ever be the gift to humanity that you are. So center your wellness because you are worth it.
I would always recommend to give yourself a foundation of health on which to add things like therapy, psychiatric treatments, any kind of the things that we've been talking about, alternative treatments like Reiki, acupuncture, but give yourself a foundation of health upon which those things go, because we're all people, we live in the context, and we need to be sleeping 8 hours a night, we need to be having a regular schedule, we need to be socializing, we need to have something productive and creative to do, we need to be eating healthy, balanced meals in moderation, and having daily physical exercise. And that's really like the foundation of health upon which anything else goes. So do not neglect the basics.
Thank you. This was such a short hour, even though it was the long hour that we've always had our regular, COVID-19 conversations. And I hope that you guys got as much from the PowerPoint presentation as you guys got from the speakers. And as Mrs. Hannah said, that such a powerful group of women. And I really enjoyed spending the hour with you guys. I don't think that mental health, I believe somebody said it earlier, that just as our mental health will take the day, if we were sick, we should take the day, because we need to deal with our mental health. And it could be something as simple as eating, calling somebody on the phone, going to the beach, taking vacation, take your PTO, it's yours, you earned it, take the break. If you have any issues or something, do not go passing out your issues in self-destructive ways, including on the ones that you are surrounded by, but you actually take the time to seek out a therapist. A therapist, it's okay. If you date a therapist, it's fine. You do not necessarily have to stick to the same therapist all throughout the time that you are doing therapies. I actually love that Danny said to take up space. I know that sometimes people want us to shrink ourselves, but it's okay to be you in a world where everybody is different and doing their own thing. Be yourself. Some people will be annoyed, some people will be upset. That's okay. There is only one you. Continue living your life, and that's a form of therapy. When you do the work on you, when you learn who you are, you become embedded by so many things. And that is the true form of therapy. Just like Naomi Ahsoka was able to say, hey, I'm protecting myself because that's important to me. I know that some of us kind of do these things, but there are some ways that we could set boundaries. So one of this is sometimes stay away from social media. I decleanse from social media every single weekend, and that is one of the best things that I could do for my mental health. It's unfortunate that sometimes when you get to Monday, all of these things come crashing on you, but I've never regret my weekends. It's one of the best things that I could do. If somebody, I know they have put that out on social media before, that if somebody is distracting you, or if somebody is making you feel bad about yourself, feel free to drop your friends. Your social circles change all the time. You grow. The people you follow, if they make you feel bad about who you are, if they make you feel small, if they make you shrink, that's okay. Let them go. That's life, and it happens every single time. And that's all about taking care of our mental health. And not only that, but sometimes we have to recognize as ourselves if we are toxic. I know that toxic was something that was going on all the time, but we also have to recognize that sometimes we as individuals are toxic because we have not learned to deal with our traumas. We have not learned to deal with our generational traumas. And at the end of the day, we need to put on the work, and it's okay. Sometimes you have to extend individual grace because everybody that is going through a problem. My mother used to always tell me, today's their day, tomorrow is another person's day. Today is your day, tomorrow is another person's day. So always remember to grant individual grace. And so before we end tonight, I just want to share my screen and say our next event will be having in time for Juneteenth, and that will be happening on June 17th. And we will be discussing Black doctoring. In this time, we will be talking about, doctors, they do have the mental traumas as well, dealing with institutions that are sometimes systemic racism exists in this institution. So we will have Dr. Quinn Capers, Dr. Lina Cosino, and Dr. Monica Webb-Hopper talking about, the pipeline and how we could get more men into medicine, and how, just like there are people who are underrepresented in medicine, but we will be talking about, the systemic racism that has existed in the medical field and what we could do moving forward to ensure that, more people see there is more representation in medicine for Black and Brown people. Please have a wonderful weekend. It is raining. Remember, stay off social media. You will not miss anything. There's no fear of missing out, no in case of missing out, nothing like that. Stay away from social media. Enjoy the time with your family. Enjoy the with yourself. Have a hot girl summer. Put out your candle. Do whatever you have to do that will make you feel better about life, because life is short and it is worth living. I'll see you guys in the next 2 weeks.